We went from nice spring weather to very close to summer weather with like this crazy stuff in the air. And so we do have our picnic coming up this Saturday, so hopefully things will be okay by then. But regardless, today, interestingly enough, is actually kind of our Good Friday message. This is where we are in the text. Jesus is on the cross. And so this is a very, this is kind of a difficult chapter in terms of what's going on, right? It's a very sorrowful passage, and this is normally what you would reflect upon on Good Friday. But that's where we are, and then we're finishing up, not next week because we have joint service, but the week afterwards is the final chapter of the Gospel of Mark, and so we're getting close to the end. But with that, the question I wanted to just kind of put in your head today is, what does the cross mean to you? Because that's really what this entire chapter is about. It's about the crucifixion. It's about the cross. And I've joked about things like the alabaster jar and Gethsemane and all these things, but really when you think about the one symbol that kind of defines Christianity, it's the cross. Right? Many of you have cross necklaces, all these different things. It's one of those symbols that it's kind of impossible to separate from Christianity. And so what I want you to really reflect and think about today is, what does this cross really mean to you? Right? Is it just a symbol? Interestingly, I lived in Russia for a while, and so they have the Orthodox cross, which is a little bit different. Have you guys ever seen that before? It's got like a little tilt on the top, and then there's a smaller one on the bottom. I think it's supposed to represent like the path of man to heaven, and then like Jesus coming down from heaven, something like that. Someone explained to me before. But some crosses are different in different church traditions. But for us, it's kind of your standard thing. But I want you to think about, what does a cross mean to me? Okay? So with that, let's go into the text, Mark 15. We're going to go through the entire chapter. So open up your Bibles, smartphones, or look at the screen. Mark chapter 15, starting from verse 1. The word Lord says this. Very early in the morning, the chief priests with the elders, the teachers of the law, and the whole Sanhedrin made their plans. So they bound Jesus, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate. "Are you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate. "You have said so," Jesus replied. The chief priests accused him of many things. So again, Pilate asked him, "Aren't you going to answer? See how many things they're accusing you of." But Jesus still made no reply, and Pilate was amazed. Now it was the custom at the festival to release a prisoner whom the people requested. A man called Barabbas was in prison with the insurrectionists who had committed murder in the uprising. The crowd came up and asked Pilate to do for them what he usually did. "Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" asked Pilate, knowing it was out of self-interest that the chief priests had handed Jesus over to him. But the chief priests stirred up the crowd to have Pilate release Barabbas instead. "What shall I do then with the one you call the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. "Crucify him," they shouted. "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers led Jesus away into the palace, that is, the praetorium, and called together the whole company of soldiers. They put a purple robe on him, then twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on him, and they began to call out to him, "Hail, King of the Jews!" Again and again they struck him on the head with a staff and spit on him. Falling on their knees, they paid homage to him, and when they had mocked him, they took off the purple robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him out to crucify him. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. He saved others, they say, but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe. Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. And at 3 in the afternoon, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing near heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. Some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joseph, and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. It was preparation day, that is, the day before the Sabbath. So as evening approached, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the council who was himself waiting for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Pilate was surprised to hear that he was already dead. Summoning the centurion, he asked him if Jesus had already died. When he heard from the centurion that it was so, he gave the body to Joseph. So Joseph brought some linen cloth, took down the body, wrapped it in the linen, and placed it in a tomb cut out of rock. Then he rolled a stone against the entrance of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where he was laid. Okay, so, like I said, a bit of a downer chapter. This is Jesus on the cross, right? And this is us getting near the end of this book that we've been going through. We're going to actually proceed into the book of Exodus as we go into this theme of this year of the gospel of freedom, seeing how God is going to bring us more freedom in our lives through his gospel. That's the hope that we have for this year, especially as we go into Exodus. And we saw last week as we finished up chapter 14, really chapter 14 was all about the failures of the disciples. They failed him so many different times. And really the thing that I wanted us to see from last week was that in spite of these failures, in spite of them disappointing even themselves, God still worked. Right? It was all according to God's plan, and he redeemed those that even failed him. And so as we get into this, what we see right away is, last chapter we saw that the Jewish council, the leaders, the Sanhedrin, they already made their decision. Kill Jesus. But they couldn't do it on their own. They needed Rome to say yes, right? So the Jews could not do this on their own, so now they had to take him to Pilate. And Pilate was the acting governor over their region, so they had to get his permission. And this would have perked the ears of the readers. Remember, the people that Mark is writing to, they live in Rome and they are under severe persecution. So they are living under this difficult season where they're getting killed for their faith by Romans themselves. And here they're seeing the Romans had a part in the story. And they're seeing that Jesus was brought to Pilate himself. And Pilate had a decision to make. But what we also see is, the only question that Pilate really asked him is, are you the one they call the King of the Jews? Right? It was a political question. That was the only thing that mattered. Jesus hadn't done anything wrong from a Roman perspective. Right? But the political question is, are you calling yourself the King of the Jews? And this is a term that comes again and again throughout this chapter. This is why I titled the sermon, The King of the Jews. Again and again, they say the King of the Jews. But every single time it comes out in this chapter, it's in a mocking tone. So Jesus says, yeah, that's what they say about me. And then Jesus didn't answer to any other accusation. All these Jewish leaders were saying all these negative things about him, and Jesus did not talk back. But at the same time, you can tell that Pilate didn't want to execute Jesus. And so he knew that he had the ability to free one of the people that was about to get killed. And so he was wanting to use that on Jesus. And we know from other Gospels, his wife had a dream, and he really didn't want to do this. But instead of choosing Jesus, the people chose Barabbas. Right? The passage talks about how Barabbas was this insurrectionist. Basically, he was a freedom fighter. He was trying to free Jerusalem. He was trying to free Israel from Roman rule. So he was going around with other people, basically killing Romans. Right? So he was like this kind of, I don't know, Jewish vigilante. I don't know. But that was basically what he was trying to do. He was trying to overthrow Roman rule. This guy was a known murderer. Was not a good guy. I remember when this is really random memory, but I grew up I went to a Baptist private school. Okay, that's how I grew up. I went to Baptist private school. We had to wear a uniform. We had to wear a white Oxford shirt and green slacks. That was our colors, white and green. And so I wore this white and green slacks for like up until 6th grade. I was there until 6th grade. But for some reason, they gave us this book called The Wine of Mourning. And I actually liked this book. This book was called The Wine of Mourning. And this book is actually the fictional story of Barabbas, as well as the two other thieves that are next to Jesus. And it gives like this elaborate story about how he's doing all these crazy things. And then he actually becomes Christian later after he is set free, this Barabbas guy. Turns out this is a book written by Bob Jones. I was actually really surprised. Because if you guys don't know America, Bob Jones is like the most conservative Christian in America. Like they actually have Bob Jones School and Bob Jones University. It's so conservative that men and women have different walkways. You cannot walk on the same path. If you get caught, you can get kicked out. But it's a very conservative school. But Bob Jones wrote this book. And they made me read this when I think I was in 4th grade or something like that. Anyway, random story. Sorry about that. So, all that said, Pilate wanted to let Jesus go, but he was put in a situation where he could not. And really, the Jewish leaders had nothing to gain by having Barabbas set free. Barabbas was actually putting them in more trouble. Right? The things Barabbas was doing was bringing negative attention to the Jews, but still they chose him over Jesus. That's how much they wanted to take him out. And so Pilate was put in a position where he couldn't do what he wanted to. He had to execute Jesus. And so this kind of makes me think of Isaiah 53:7, where it says, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." This entire passage, you see Jesus just like this. As a lamb being led to the slaughter, he's being accused, he's being mocked, and yet he doesn't speak back. And so what we see is just this scene of just some of the most, I don't know, like, this is just a very difficult scene to read, because you're just seeing Jesus being completely humiliated and mocked, and they're hitting him, they're putting on this purple robe, they're putting on this crown of thorns, they're doing everything that they can to make him look foolish and to make him look shameful. And Jesus just takes him. And this is where the title, King of the Jews, keeps coming up again and again. They call him the King of the Jews. Why can't he come down? This guy who's called the Messiah, he can help others, but he can't help himself. And Jesus just takes it. Doesn't say a word. Like a lamb led to the slaughter. Now, while Jesus is going, we see from some of the other Gospels that Jesus has been beaten so severely that he can't even carry the beam of the cross on his own. Like he's physically that weakened. And so they bring this man Simon from Cyrene, and they talk about how he's the father of Alexander and Rufus. This is important because why would Mark bring this up? It's most likely because Alexander and Rufus were actually in the church. Right? And we actually see in Romans 16:13, there's a Rufus mentioned there that many people believe is this son of Simon the Cyrene. And it talks about how his mother, Simon's wife, was like a mother to Paul. So it's kind of interesting that Mark mentions these people mainly because the people that he's writing to probably knew Alexander and Rufus. And so we're seeing that this interesting story that their father helped Jesus carry his cross, literally. And then it leads us straight to the crucifixion. Now, let me warn you, I'm going to get a little bit detailed in terms of what happens on a crucifixion. So for some of you that are a little squeamish, you might not like the details. But basically, you guys know what happened, right? So Jesus is taken, he's nailed to the cross. Now, most people are depicted through the hand. The hand can't hold your weight. It's actually most likely through the wrist, and there's actually a lot of paintings and what that show that they often nail through the wrist. Now, one thing is, nailing was not the normal way to crucify. Actually, they used to crucify just by tying you by rope. Right? That was one of the other ways to do it. It's less painful. But with Jesus, they nailed. So and actually, I think the word hand actually includes the wrist. But regardless, it's likely through the wrist, as well as through his feet. And so he's nailed to this wooden cross. There's also they have this thing called the seat. There's a small little piece of wood, or I guess you could kind of rest on a little bit. But basically, the crucifixion is one of the most cruelest forms of torture. It is probably one of the most cruelest forms of being executed. Like in a hanging, it's done in seconds, right? I'm sure it's not a fun 5 to 10 seconds or whatever it is, but it's over almost instantly. Crucifixions can take days. Which is why at the end of the passage, when Joseph goes to get the body of Jesus, Pilate's like, what, he's already dead? Because the expectation was it often took many days. And so basically what's going on is you're nailed, Jesus was nailed to the cross. And the thing is, what the cross basically does is it's a slow form of suffocation. The reason why is because when you're like this, and your body is kind of up against this, you are in a state of exhale, right? Your body is in a state where it's meant to breathe out. But to breathe in, you would actually have to pull your body up to get into a position to inhale. So think about that. Every time you are inhaling a breath, you're pulling against your weight. So the nail in your wrist is you're pulling against that. You're pulling your body up. Remember, his back had been beaten severely, so his back was exposed. It was raw, and it's rubbing up against this wood basically. And so basically, every single time Jesus had to take a breath, it was an excruciating amount of pain. And that's what was going on. That was how he would keep living, is he would have to keep pulling himself up to breathe. And eventually, your body would get so beat up, so worn out, that you would lose the ability to pull yourself up anymore, and you would basically suffocate. That's what the cross is. It is a slow form of torture. It is public. It's done in front of the masses, because by being so cruel and by being so public, it tells everybody, don't mess with us. That's why Rome did it. Right? They made it so public and such a excruciating torture that anyone would think, okay, I will not do something that would get me on a cross. That's what it was. That's what Jesus went through. It's a slow, but painful death. In the midst of all of this, everyone's insulting him. Even the people next to him on their own crosses are insulting him. That's what Jesus went through. Now, other Gospels talk about how they actually wanted to break his legs, because they're like, hey, it's Passover, we got preparations to do, we got a party coming up, can you speed this up? And so basically, if you break the legs, it makes it almost impossible to pull yourself up anymore, right? So that is a way to quicken the process as you break the legs. But what we see is he was already dead at that point, when they were about to break his legs. But what we see is also they put the spear in his side, and out comes water plus blood together, right? Now, some medical people think that what happened there is that can happen physically, where the water separates from the blood. But what one medical scholar had said was he felt that what actually killed Jesus wasn't suffocation, but it was a rupture of the heart. That his heart literally exploded. And that's what caused the water to separate from the blood. I don't know, I'm not a medical practitioner. We have someone who's trying to become one. Maybe she can figure it out. But regardless, that shows you the amount of intense suffering that Jesus was going through. That it wasn't just physical. There was a spiritual element. Jesus even says, my God, why have you forsaken me? So he's feeling that separation from his Father. There's also this weight that he was carrying of knowing that he was bearing the sins of many. And so there's so many things we can't understand. But I can explain from a physical point of view, there's very few more difficult ways to die than to die on a cross. But in terms of what Jesus actually experienced, I can't say fully, but I can tell you physically, that's a tough way to go. And that's what Jesus suffered. So actually what I do, normally when I do a Good Friday service, I haven't done a Good Friday service in many years because we do these joint Good Friday services, is I normally make everyone stand and then make a cross. And make you hold it for about 10 minutes. Now, when I was a kid and my grandparents got angry at me, they punished me Korean style, and they would make me do this. And they said, do that for 30 minutes. In about 5 minutes, you want to die. you're angry, and because your arms, the weight of your arms, just holding them up or holding them in position, it starts to burn, right? It's a very painful thing, right? And so what I normally do on Good Friday is I make everybody stand, I make everybody make a cross, and I say, just pray, and you are going to feel a minor fraction of what Jesus went through. But in the midst of that small suffering, just remember what he did for you. That's what I normally do. I'm not going to do it today. Unless you guys really want to. But anyway, this is what Jesus experienced on the cross. And so for us, honestly, we will never suffer anything physically that's anywhere close to this. But at the same time, let me also tell you that it wasn't just a physical suffering that Jesus went through. There's so much more to it, and I can't even understand it. So he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? For the first time in his life, Jesus is feeling a separation from his Father. And then as Jesus passes away and he breathes his last, this Roman centurion, again, this would have really caught the ears of those that Mark is writing to, is these people that are suffering under Roman oppression, it's actually a Roman centurion that says, surely this man was the Son of God. Throughout the rest of the passage, everyone is mockingly calling Jesus the King of the Jews and doing all these hurtful and shameful and just mean things to him. But the only voices of reason were the Romans, right? Pilate himself, he saw through what the Jewish leaders were trying to do. He realized that they were doing this out of their own self-interest, and he wanted to do the right thing, but he couldn't. This Roman centurion, his job is literally just to stand there, but he sees everything that's going on. He sees everything that Jesus is receiving, everything that he's doing. And his proclamation is, surely this man was the Son of God. And it's likely this very same centurion that Pilate asked, hey, is Jesus dead already? And in the midst of this, throughout this entire chapter, where everyone that should have embraced Jesus as their king is doing the exact opposite, but the outsiders, Pilate, the centurion, they're the ones who actually seem to have a clear head. They're the ones who actually seem to be able to see what the truth is. That's the irony. And then we move into the passage, and Joseph of Arimathea, who we see as someone who is waiting for the kingdom, meeting someone who is a believer, who believes in Jesus. He's part of the Sanhedrin. He goes, he gets the body of Jesus, and he puts it into a tomb, and it's covered with a stone. Right? So this is setting it up for our next meeting 2 weeks from now, which is our Easter message, where Jesus is risen. But here we see the preparations are made. Jesus is buried. His body is taken. So clearly, Jesus has died. And so, here's the thing, is this cross, this humiliating death, this was all part of God's plan. This is all what God was setting up so that he could bring us back into relationship with him. This goes all the way back to Genesis 3. Right? What happened in Genesis 3? You guys remember? Right? The fall, right? Adam and Eve, right? So sin comes into the world, but just as sin comes in, Genesis 3:15, a plan is already in place. That the seed of the woman is going to come and is going to bring redemption and salvation. Right? The moment sin enters, there's already a plan. And we see it throughout the Old Testament, and here we see it in its fruition on the cross. Now, at the same time, Jesus suffered a death that honestly it's one that no one deserves. Right? You really look at what happened, you really look at how he was treated, and we knew that he was innocent, and yet he suffered regardless. This is the type of death that Jesus chose on our behalf. But he did it willingly. Right? The passage talks about how he never spoke up. You see person after person insulting him, person after person mocking him, person after person persecuting him, oppressing him, just doing every possible thing they could do. And he just took it like a lamb led to the slaughter. Now, I remember when I was learning the concept of Christ in the Old Testament, and this is one of the passages that when I first really saw what it was, it just kind of blew my mind. Now, remember, Jesus said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's coming straight from Psalm 22, okay? Psalm 22. Who wrote Psalm 22? You guys know? David, right? King David. King David wrote this actually when he was not king. He was running away. He was trying to get killed by, he was basically running for his life. And this guy, he's running for his life, and he's writing this psalm out of his frustration, out of his desire to express the things that he's going through, right? So basically, David is running for his life, and he's suffering oppression, and this is the psalm that he writes to express that, right? It's a very emotional psalm. And in this psalm, he writes the following. This is King David, or David I should say, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night, but I find no rest. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one Israel praises. In you our ancestors put their trust. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by everyone, despised by people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. Yet you brought me out of the womb. You made me trust in you, even at my mother's breast. From birth I was cast on you. From my mother's womb you have been my God. You do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions that tear their prey open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and my feet. All my bones are on display. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs. Rescue me from the mouth of the lions. Save me from the horns of the wild oxen. I will declare your name to my people in the assembly. I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all you descendants of Israel.
For he has not despised or scorned the suffering of the afflicted one. He has not hidden his face from him, but has listened to his cry for help. From you comes a theme of my praise in the great assembly. Before those who fear you, I will fulfill my vows. The poor will eat and be satisfied. Those who seek the Lord will praise him. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him. Those who cannot keep themselves alive, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. Did you catch that? Psalm 22, David is expressing his frustration and is basically a depiction of the crucifixion. It talks about how his hands and feet are pierced, right? It talks about, it's just like his mouth is dried up, his heart has turned to wax. All these different things that in many ways, it even talks about the casting of lots for his clothes, right? It's like basically an entire reenactment of the crucifixion hundreds of years before it even happened. This is what David wrote. And yet, the way it ends is, he has done it. You see, the first part of Psalm 22 is this frustration, and it's building up the scene, and it's talking about all the different afflictions that David is going through. But then the second half turns into an amazing praise to the Lord. And it's basically saying that there is a purpose behind all this suffering. There's a purpose for why this all happened. There's a greater plan in place. And at the end of the day, God has done it. So what I want us to remember is that this cross, this thing that David, for whatever reason, kind of basically wrote about when he was talking about his own, the things that he was going through, this is the glory of Jesus Christ. Throughout this entire chapter, there's nothing gloriful here, right? Nothing glorious. You see mocking, shame. But brothers and sisters, this is the glory of Jesus Christ. We will see that when we go into the next part. And we will see that he is indeed not just the King of the Jews, but he is the King over all. And ironically, it's interesting that David is the one who wrote Psalm 22, because David is the one who gets the promise from God himself that there will be a future king, a future heir of David, who will reign forever. And brothers and sisters, that's Jesus Christ. And it's through the cross. It's through the cross that all these things come to fruition. That this plan of redemption that was there from the very beginning when sin entered the world was going to happen through the death of Jesus on the cross. Now, how many of you guys saw Passion of the Christ? Some of you might have been young when it came out. Some of you maybe not so young. But when it came out, I was a working adult, and actually, I'm thankful I didn't watch it right when it came out, because there's a lot of extra stuff that's not from the Bible that if I had watched it without knowing this, I would have been very upset. But I knew about this before I watched it, because I watched it about a week later. Regardless, I only watched it once, because it was honestly a difficult movie to watch. Because it's all about the suffering of Jesus. And there's 5 seconds of the risen Lord at the very end. Okay. But it's all about the suffering. And honestly, that's what this would be. If I just focused on Mark 15 and that's it, that would be the Passion of the Christ. Right? But brothers and sisters, it's what happens after that's actually so much better. Without the resurrection, the story of Jesus is just a tragedy. A terrible thing. And that's it. Brothers and sisters, there's so much more. Actually, interestingly enough, apparently Mel Gibson is working on a sequel to The Passion of the Christ called The Resurrection. Apparently he said it's about 3 years out, Granted, I'm not a big fan of him, but regardless, they are going to make a sequel to the resurrection, or to the Passion of Christ. But regardless, for us today, brothers and sisters, what I want us to remember is, yes, understand that Jesus suffered and he died for you. But know that there is a purpose behind it. Know that there is something glorious behind it. And that is where our hope is. So with that, let's take some time to pray and we'll go ahead and close for today. You know, as we took the communion today and as we looked upon this chapter that showed what Jesus went through on our behalf, let's take a moment just to reflect upon what Jesus has done for us. What he did for us on the cross and what he did that we couldn't do. Or what he did that took away from what we deserved. So let's just take a moment to remember who Jesus is and what he's done for us. Let's pray. Throughout this chapter, as the term the King of the Jews was proclaimed mostly in a mocking tone, let's actually take a moment to proclaim Jesus as the King over us, the King over our lives. So let's proclaim him to be our King and what that means. So let's pray and proclaim Jesus as our King. Jesus, you suffered for us in probably the most difficult way, in a way that you didn't deserve, but you did so willingly, without hesitation, and you received what we actually deserved. Place, we proclaim you as our King. We proclaim you as the majestic one who reigns forever. That on that cross that you conquered death, you conquered sin, and you restored what was once lost. That once again we can be in relationship with God. So we thank you and we praise you and we proclaim you as King of our lives. So reign in our hearts. Reign over everything that we do. May you alone be glorified. We thank you. We praise you in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Let's just give to God our finances today as we sing this song together. We became sin. We became sin.